The purpose of something like this. So we ask people to come in with work in progress, which means that they come with the understanding that it's not a final product, which means they're open to some criticism in the best sense of the critique and suggestions. And we in turn are respectful of the fact that it's in progress, and we don't judge them too severely based on what we've written so far. In this case, actually, the project has about 1 more month of revisions to go.
Yeah, that's right. So make it good.
So my suggestion is that recommending that the whole thing be rewritten not only is not needed, but it wouldn't be useful. Regarding this very fine piece that we have in front of us. But at the same time, I'm sure people will have things to suggest. Oh, absolutely. So Doug Rogers is, I think, the model of an anthropologist that everyone else can read and understand. He's really multidisciplinary. The better way I can describe it. Should we call it like some sort of historical anthropology at the same time? This is your second project dealing with this region, right? And this one takes us much more into something which is in everyone's mind in Russia these days. And it's topical, but no less meaningful and important, which is the problem of the oil industry. Problem in the sense of something worthy of investigation, multifaceted. He's given us a chapter which is on the cultural production of oil and oil as cultural production. And but it's part of a larger project which he'd like to speak to us in a more extended way, so we get a sense of where what the project is overall. And then we can weigh in with comments on the text in particular.
Yeah.
All right, so go ahead.
All right, so thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've learned an enormous amount about Russia already just by reading the blog, the things in the blog. So it's a pleasure to actually be here and see some place in action. As Yanni said, this project is approaching completion, and you have the final chapter. But if you've read that, you know there's people who've read that before as a standalone thing are often asking for the pieces that lead up to it or what it does to wrap these things together. So I wanted to take a little while at first to give you the prehistory of that chapter. And I think that will save at least some of the initial questions that you might have to sort of clarify what's going on in that chapter, and then you can get to some what I'm trying to do with the project as a whole. So this is a reasonably informal talk that's going to take me through the earlier parts of the book that you'll see, but I think you'll pick up the threads that are tied together in this chapter that you read. So this talk is, as the book as a whole, tells an uncommon story about Russian oil. Now, the common story that you all know about Russian oil is about the intersections of law and taxes in Kremlin politics or intrigue. They're about oil revenues and federal budgets, perhaps about international collaborations or pipeline projects. These are important stories, but we know much less about how the centrality of oil to Russian contemporary politics and economics and to social and cultural life is played out at the ground level. And my story is based in the Perm Region and is intended to sort of correct that, at least a bit, that common story. Along with the rest of the Volga-Urals oil basin, this was the Soviet second Baku, the pride of the oil production in the mid-20th century. Production in this part of Russia has been more or less in decline since the late 1970s, as Soviet and then Russian production efforts shifted to Siberian fields. It's now an important production and refining center for oil. I'm especially concerned today and in the broader book that I'm working on with the role of oil in the making and the remaking of Russia as a region, something I think you'll get as I go. And on an analytical level, I'll just say to begin with, I'm working within a set of anthropological and allied approaches that foreground materiality, semiotics, representations, as intrinsic primary elements of how natural resources become political and become economic. And I'm interested in combining those kinds of approaches with more traditional political economy. I'm not going to really belabor those theoretical or conceptual issues in my talk today, but you'll see that they make up the primary thread of this tale as it moves from the Soviet period into the 1990s and then into the 2000s. We're going to focus on oil as it has moved, concretely and specifically through production and refining and distribution, as it's entered into wider means and patterns of exchange, as it has been represented in state and corporate projects, and then as it has shaped discourses and practices of time and space. I want to begin with Soviet oil. In April of 1929, oil was discovered in the Perm Region, and it was quickly cast as crucial to the Soviet project. As Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's deputy and people's commissar of the oil industry from 1939 to 1940, put it to the 18th Party Congress in 1939, Everyone understands that without oil there is no tractor, and if there is no tractor, there is no wheat or cotton. Without oil, there are no cars, no aviation. Kaganovich's declaration notwithstanding, the most remarkable aspect of socialist oil was its comparative lack of significance within the Soviet Union, relative to both other sectors of the Soviet economy and to the prominence of the oil sector in contemporaneous capitalist contexts. Recalling her Soviet-era opinion of the oil industry for me one day, an acquaintance who had worked at a prestigious Soviet armaments factory in Perm wrinkled her nose with disdain. An oil worker? An oil worker? Who's that? Neftyalnik. Neftyalnik is next door. Western social and cultural historians of the Soviet period have generally had the same opinion, wrinkling their nose in the same way. They are all, by and large, right. Oil did, in fact, play a comparatively insignificant role in the Perm region itself during the Soviet era. Despite the region's informal designation as the Second Baku, its status as a marquee production region in the middle of the 20th century, and the Soviet federal budget's reliance on oil revenues, especially in the later Soviet period. So how are we to understand this? Permian oil was the world's first fully socialist oil, discovered, developed, and flowing through an emergent set of political, economic, social, and cultural configurations that differed radically from those of the capitalist world. The political economy of socialism, then, is where we should look first. Catherine Verdery argued some time ago that the central drive of socialist political and economic organization was toward the maximization of the capacity to redistribute. She termed this allocative power and distinguished it from the drive, both the drive to maximize profit, which is characteristic of capitalist systems, and a simple drive to maximize the quantity of resources under control. The field of allocative power was a primary terrain of struggle in socialist societies, both within the planning bureaucracy itself, as planners and enterprise directors at different levels and in different sectors sought to increase their capacity to allocate relative to one another, and between the party state as a whole and its citizens, who often registered discontent that not enough was being allocated in their direction. What, in this general scheme, do we want to do with oil and the oil sector? To begin with, oil production is highly dependent on specialized machinery and equipment. In capitalist contexts, acquiring that specialized equipment is generally not a problem. Oil companies pay top dollar for it, and so therefore do consumers, all of us. Soviet oil production associations, however, depended on the central planning bureaucracy and especially on heavy industry to obtain steel pipe, drilling bits, motors, and many other items of industrial equipment. Would steel mills and machine shops produce drilling pipe or tractor frames? And who would get them? Would they arrive on time? Would they work at all? Far greater stores of allocative power were thus located in heavy industry and its political allies, and procurement specialists in the oil sector competed with their counterparts in other sectors to get higher on the list of what could be produced and who would get it. The case of oil, in other words, confirms rather than challenges the view that allocative power accumulated in socialist heavy industry and not in the energy sector at all, and not in oil. Consider, too, the question of where the extracted oil was headed. From the 1950s to the end of the Soviet period, a portion of the Perm region's oil was exported abroad. All exports ran through a single entity, and the hard currency proceeds realized from these international exchanges went into Soviet central coffers. They did not return directly to the regional production associations, such as Perm. Export proceeds, therefore, did not create the kinds of local and regional oil booms that we find in so many capitalist contexts, because money never flowed back to the companies. This is crucial. Within the Soviet Union, socialist oil never had the tight relationship with money that has been so prevalent in the capitalist oil industry. However important oil exports were for the Soviet budget at the federal level, which I'll just stipulate today, although I think it's probably more complicated than in actual fact. These exports controlled by Moscow simply fell out of the struggle for allocative power at the regional level. Socialist central planning and allocative power in some created a fundamentally different relationship between the national center and an oil region than we find in the capitalist world, one in which exports diminished the power of regional producers by taking oil out of their hands and with little in return. Domestically, oil from the Volga-Urals basin made possible some of the major transformations in the post-Stalin decades, among them military buildup, increasingly mechanized agriculture, and the integration of different regions of the Soviet Union through truck and bus transportation. Here too, however, Permneft, as an oil-producing association, was in a comparatively weak position. Even though Permneft's oil was crucial for all of these aspects of the socialist project, the crude it extracted was, in and of itself, fairly useless without refining into various types of fuels and other petrochemical products. It was these refined oil products, and more to the point, the capacity to produce and allocate them, and not the extracted crude itself, that allowed for the accumulation of a degree, at least, of allocative power in the socialist oil complex. But Permneft had no direct or official relationship to refined oil products at all. The same was true in the second economy. Hawking crude oil straight out of the ground wasn't going to get you very where. It's possible, but not very desirable. There's not much you can do with oil until it's refined. We in the West are accustomed to vertically integrated oil companies, the model pioneered by Rockefeller Standard Oil, in which a single company controls production, refining, and distribution. But this was not the case in the Soviet Union, when the trend over the socialist period, socialist period was toward greater institutional separation between oil production and refining. Indeed, by the mid-20th century, refining and production were located in entirely different, separate Soviet federal ministries. Pnos's ability to turn crude oil into an increasing number of products that were central to nearby industry, agriculture, and heat and power generation, as well as more distant transport, military, and aviation, made them far more central to regional networks and power dynamics than production associations like Permneft. But the true pride of the Perm region was never oil or energy of any sort. As in the rest of the Urals, the places at the top of the pecking order were occupied by metallurgy, heavy industry, and defense. None of the leaders of the Soviet-era's regional party committees in the Perm region, for instance, hailed from the oil industry. Most had risen through the ranks of factories or from internal communist party structures, with a smattering of representation from the agricultural sector. Illustrative of this is a story that I heard several times as my interlocutors emphasized the low prestige of the oil industry in the Soviet period. Of the 10 telephones on the desk of the head of the regional executive committee of the party in the late Soviet period, not a single one connected him to an oil enterprise, despite the fact that this was the Soviet Union's biggest oil production center. My final point about socialist oil, which I'll just mention briefly today, has to do with the symbolic and cultural dimensions of the Soviet project, the ways in which labor, industry, subjectivity, and the country's path to a communist future were represented in everything from art to film to everyday life. Here, too, there was little in the way of prestige or exemplary status for oil in its industry. Even as the first oil flowed from beneath the Perm region and whispers about the second Baku proliferated, it was images of steel and iron, and not oil gushers and oil rigs that were everywhere. They comprised some of the most basic visual and literary imagery of the early Soviet period in the Urals. Stalin was the man of steel, not oil, and the grand exemplar of socialism in the Urals was the Magnitogorsk, not some oil town. Perm itself was renamed Molotov from 1940 to 1957, the very years in which it solidified its reputation as the second Baku. So that's socialist oil. Low prestige, loosely linked to money, and even then only at some distance from production sites, and largely absent from the symbolic vocabulary of socialism. As an oil region, the Volga-Urals basin in the Perm region was very, very different from Texas, Oklahoma, western Venezuela, eastern Saudi Arabia, the Niger Delta, and so on. And I think we miss this when, as many political scientists and others do these days, we talk about the Soviet Union as a petrostate, or an oil exporter, things like this, that elides many of the most important things about how oil worked in the socialist system. I've started with the socialist period because I think it sets us up to see the post-socialist period differently. The standard story of oil after socialism, which you also know, focuses on a battle over production fields that fought largely in Moscow and in the boardrooms of international oil companies. It includes insider deals, loans for shares, for instance, and no shortage of Kremlin-centric intrigue, especially around and after the 1993 decrees that governed oil sector privatization. This is a significant story, to be sure, but it is far from the only one. In the Perm region, the rise of the oil sector predated privatization, and it emerged not out of production at all, but, as my socialist history here would suggest, out of the circulation of refined products. As the Soviet factories of the Perm region disintegrated along with the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1991, Pnos, the city's oil refinery, unexpectedly found itself with a crucial advantage. Unlike nearly every other regional enterprise, it could, independently for the first time, exchange its products on international markets. This very early 1990s transformation of Pnos's refined oil into many other kinds of goods through circuits of exchange that extended into the international arena was the opening wedge in the process by which oil came to undergird the means of exchange in the post-Soviet period, something that it had never done in the Soviet period. And this is where the story starts, after socialism. Consider the account of a former Lukoil employee whom I asked in 2011 to recall the place of the oil industry in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union. She began by focusing on Knos. It was all done by barter, she said. There was no money. Knos worked on barter with the Chinese. They imported down jackets, well-made ones. Knos employees got them and just went down to the market, the main city market, and sold them for crazy money. There was nothing to wear, nothing in stores. Knos got those jackets for their workers in exchange for oil products. So refinery employees, that is, received internationally bartered items like down jackets in lieu of cash salary, as bonuses by dint of connections or by other means. And then a significant portion of these items then made their way to street corner markets in the region more broadly, where they were widely understood to have arrived through internationally bartered oil. As the Perm Region's industrial base continued to erode, the refinery's international cash sales and barter deals expanded, and they began to include all manner of fashionable items. Knos became ever more central to regional exchange. On one memorable occasion, for instance, an international barter deal with Japan brought nearly 100 brand new Toyotas to the Perm Region, and those with close connections to the refinery snapped up the new cars immediately. Knos had, in the words of one published memoir from those days, and this is a quote, unexpectedly become a prestigious place to work. In the very early 1990s, that is, a new regional elite was beginning to coalesce and spread outward from Knos, from the refinery, and internationally bartered oil was central to the exchanges in which it participated. This kind of exchange spread rapidly. In 1992, a new company named Oil Products Marketing, linked to Knos and initially part of the Perm Commodity Exchange, established the circulation of oil products as central to new forms and patterns of exchange across the entire region. One of my interlocutors gave an example of the kinds of exchanges that, he said, characterized the work of oil products marketing in those early years of demonetization. This is what he said. There were lots of long chains of exchange. So we provided fuel oil to the logging enterprises somewhere up north and more or less got uncut timber for them. We processed it into packaging timber and sent it off to the Krasnodar region. This is the real Krasnodar region in the Caucasus. And there we took not money, but apples. We brought the apples here, sold them, and got money for the apples. That's the kind of operation we did to the fifth or sixth link. Petrobarter operations like this were, moreover, closely entangled with the interests and projects of the regional state government, which continued to face pervasive complaints and borderline unrest during the ongoing shortages of both food and fuel across the Perm region throughout the 1990s. There were thousands of these barter chains and deals, and the thing that all of them had in common was refined oil products from Knos. Petrobarter operations basically kept the rural areas of the Perm region from starving in the early 1990s. Oil products were as close as it came in those years to a general equivalent, and those who specialized in it were quickly becoming the new regional elite. Petrobarter was also influenced emergent senses of regional identity and began to link them in new ways with the materialities and the movements of oil. Flowing along the lines of Petrobarter, 1990s Permian oil and its derivatives were often discussed as concrete, reliable, local, tangible, non-generalizable, ours, Permian. Precisely a contrast to the unpredictable and massively abstracted nature of rubles and money in the banking, salary, street corner exchange, and pyramid scheme sectors. Oil bartered into apples, not to mention crops, sown and harvested in the region thanks to collaboration between oil products marketing and the regional state administration, were repeatedly deployed as evidence that oil in the Perm region was not simply being transformed into money. To give but one example, in a lengthy newspaper article directed to those who criticized oil products marketing for its rapidly accumulating wealth, for instance, the company's leadership argued that local business people, like themselves, were much preferable to Moscow structures and foreign ownership, for local circles of business owners would be most likely to concern themselves with the growth of the regional economy. The Perm region's post-socialist Petrobarter thus indexed locality, regional imaginaries, and the ability to stand up against international and national centers of power by fleeing from the most exchangeable and abstract currency, money, into local regimes of value that had some tangible materiality, some connection to the Permian region. This was Permian oil, and that mattered. These framings helped, among other things, to legitimate the rise of this new elite at Knos and oil products marketing. Now, all of this happened, remember, before the privatization of production fields that began in earnest in 1993 and eventually placed Permneft, the production association, in the hands of Lukoil. That's another story that I won't get into today. Let me stick here with the ongoing significance of materiality and circulation even after petrobarter wound down and privatization picked up. In the mid-1990s, Russia was sinking deeper and deeper into what became known as the non-payments crisis. Inter-enterprise debts and tax arrears began to pile up higher and higher, and money again retreated as a means of exchange. Given the scope and scale of the mutually accumulated debt, barter and offset trade were common, but generally insufficient. The preferred strategy that emerged across Russian regions was the circulation of vexels. Usually rendered in English as promissory notes or bills of exchange, vexels were financial instruments issued in specific denominations that entitled the bearer to a quantity of goods or money. Although they could technically be redeemed for the amount of cash or goods on their face, and they sometimes were, the true purpose of vexels was to provide a short-term, limited circulation, regionally specific surrogate currency for paying down debts. There's vexel. Vexels came in various flavors across Russia, issued by banks, corporations, and occasionally state agencies. In the Perm region, by far the most popular were fuel vexels, backed by and redeemable for quantities of refined oil products. Beginning in 1995, only days after it officially registered in the region, Lukoil Perm began issuing vexels, numbered paper promissory notes that could be redeemed on demand for a specified quantity of oil products. The amount of vexels issued was set to track with the amount of oil products turned out by Punos, so that the redemption demand could never exceed the regional supply of oil products. If you're wondering how this happened so fast, this is because the management of Lukoil Perm, the regional subsidiary, was in fact all of those same guys from Punos and oil products marketing who became oil employees as part of privatization. So they're basically doing the same thing now in a different entity. The initial vexel circuits were limited to the region's oil sector enterprises, one financial industrial group, regional electricity company, and the regional state administration, all of which were signatories to a mutual agreement to accept vexels in lieu of cash. So, for example, the region's oil sector enterprises were permitted to exchange vexels among themselves and to use them in lieu of money to settle their tax debts to the region. The regional state administration, in turn, often redeemed vexels for Punos's oil products to supply the fuel-hungry agricultural sector. Punos exchanged 80% of its output of oil products without money in 1995. Although at first limited to a small selection of large corporations in the regional state apparatus, as someone put it to me, you can't pay a school teacher or a doctor in a vexel. One participant leads the use of vexels quickly expanded to mid and even small-scale businesses. By later 1995 and 1996, enterprises large and small were exchanging fuel-backed vexels to pay down their accumulated debts. Like petrobarter, vexels had a crucial semiotic and material dimension, one that differed from money issued by a federal state. Unlike state currency, vexels embedded tangible traces of the indebtedness they moved through, and in doing so, they called forth their own forms of sociality. Here's how. Each and every vexel transaction had to be recorded in 3 ways in order to be officially legal. The first was an acts of purchase sale, in which the two parties to each exchange recorded the transaction, complete with passport identification, signatures, and official stamps in their own accounting books. The second was in the general logs kept by a dedicated company, which also recorded every single transaction. Indeed, tracking vexels to the region was a small industry in and of itself, requiring a constant stream of visits among accounting office personnel and phone calls to verify authenticity, register transactions, and so on. Acquaintances recounted to me the ways in which vexels were rolled up and carried around. Given that they were so carefully tracked, theft was much less of a concern than it was for large amounts of cash. So office staffs did not hesitate to travel around Perm's trolley and tram network with millions of rubles or tons of oil products worth of vexels tucked into their bags for delivery to clients. And third, perhaps most interesting way, was on the vexel itself. As each vexel circulated, transactions were logged in dedicated lines in the back of the note. You can see some of this here. And additional pages could be attached as needed. Personal signatures were required, as opposed to stamps or other mechanical means. When I asked former governor of the region, Gumanov, whether the Perm region's vexels were traded anywhere else, his response quickly moved past issues of regional sovereignty that I was thinking about, and to the vexels themselves. No, it was just our internal affair. And a vexel, I saved one for a long time and only just gave it to the museum. It was a paper 1.5 meters long, on which there were the stamps and signatures of the directors and accountants of the businesses that were participating. You hand it over to someone, that one to the next, to the next. It was great. It was a terrific program for reducing collective debts at the time. The very materiality of the Wechsel, that is, enumerated with extraordinary precision the mutual circles of debt and obligation that made up the mid-1990s Perm Region, by listing them, one after the next, in original signatures for everyone in the chain to see and inscribe themselves into. You may have heard economists Clifford Gaddy and Barry Ickes popularize the term virtual economy to refer to this period in Soviet and post-Soviet political and economic transformations. Although they're right that the prices did not conform to what their own economic theory would predict and prescribe, virtualization is precisely the opposite of what was actually happening in the Perm Region. Although fuel vexels were more abstracted than petrobarter exchanges, they continued to make debts, obligations, and social relationships far more material, visible, and concrete than the abstractions of monetary currency. Anthropologist Gustav Peebles has argued that as national currencies, national paper currencies proliferated, they redirected signs of international value, gold or silver, to signs of national value, a national hoard of money. With circulating vexels in the Perm Region, we see a different version of this process. National currency, rubles, were locked up in debts, and surrogate currency, backed by the regional oil company, served in its place as a key means of exchange. If in Peebles' account, national paper currency serves an inverted panopticon, in which citizens look back to the state as a guarantor of their daily exchange rate, then fuel vexels accomplish something similar in a different and regional scale way. Vexels pointed not to a national hoard, not to the Soviet factory elite, not to the Communist Party, not even the Perm's regional government. The centerpiece and guarantor of the Perm Region, the entity towards which all eyes turned in those years, was written on the face of Wechsel, Lukoil Perm. You see down on the bottom, this is a Lukoil Perm, Wechsel. In later years, Lukoil Perm prided itself on having some of the best marketing and publicity specialists in the region. But it is hard to imagine a more comprehensive way for the company to establish itself at the center of the Perm Region immediately after acquiring local oil operations than by issuing and guaranteeing the region's primary currency. Here then was the true first remaking of the Perm Region as an oil region, not in production, at least not yet, but in the sphere of circulation. In the era of Wechsels, eyes in the Perm Region were turned inward to specifically regional circuits of exchange as against national circuits signified by money. They were also increasingly turned downward to the depths from which the oil flowed, and to the corporation whose regional subsidiaries were solidifying control over that flow and its intersections with all others, Lukoil. There was new and increasing interest in what lay under the Perm Region to a far greater extent than there ever had been before. This is part of what I mean by Russian oil from below. The from below is in fact literal. People began to think about the subsoil in ways that they never had before. Lukoil is, of course, a vertically integrated multinational company. And by the late 1990s and early 2000s, especially with rising global oil prices, money began coursing into the Perm Region and became closely associated with, for the first time ever, with the region's oil production districts. This poses a question for the story I've told so far. Was it the case that the increasing abstraction of the money form, the increasing integration of the Perm Region into Russian and global flows of oil and capital, put an end to the kind of connections between the materiality of the oil complex and senses of regional identity that I've been arguing grew up in the early and mid-1990s? My answer is no, they did not, at least not entirely, although they did shift. And they shifted from the sphere of circulation, petrobarter and Wechsels, to a new domain, Lukoil Perm's corporate social responsibility projects. I'll explain what I mean by this. By the early 2000s, the executive who had run oil products marketing, along with their collaborators in the 1990s state apparatus, had successfully inserted themselves into global oil and now ran its regional subsidiaries. They were in the process of becoming fantastically wealthy. But they were also beset by critique from all sides. There were popular critiques of the massive wealth accumulated by these new Russians. There were especially sharp critiques from production districts. The company no longer controlled as much of the social sphere, kindergartens, the clubs, the apartment buildings, as it once did. And district-level politicians were well aware of the massive sums that the oil company beneath them was generating. They, and residents of these districts not employed in the oil sector, did not hesitate to make enormous claims on the company. There were finally critiques from various levels of the resurgent Russian state apparatus, as the Putin administration made clear companies would need to invest at home. Everywhere in the Perm region, there remained significant anxieties about what it meant that Permian oil was now under control of a Moscow-based corporation. As one Lukoil Perm employee put it to me, recalling the early 2000s, the opinion of the oil industry could not have been much worse. In response to all of this, Lukoil Perm opened a new division in 2001 called Connections with Society. It was charged with reimagining the company's relationships with both society as a whole and with organs of state power. It was one of the first divisions of its kind in Russia, and the well-connected players hired to run it quickly set about looking for new models for corporate relationships with the people of the Perm region. They hit on a hybrid of two things: the corporate social responsibility projects of the Western extractive industry, oil and mining companies around the world do this, which funnel corporate money into local development initiatives. And, on the other hand, the aid programs that Western aid agencies, USAID, the Eurasia Foundation, the British Charities Aid Foundation, were running across the former Soviet world at the time. Lukoil Perm began running what it called corporate social and cultural project competitions, in which state and non-state agencies, from libraries to schools to churches to folklore ensembles and beyond, could apply for funding to run events and projects. The company put significant funds beyond this initiative. In the early 2000s, these funds far exceeded state expenditures, especially in the field of culture. In the decade between Lukoil Perm's first entry into the social and cultural projects competition in 2002 and this program's 10th anniversary in 2012, the annual funding that the company contributed rose from around 2 million rubles to nearly 30 million rubles. In the 2004 competition, 84 projects were funded out of a total of 294 applications. By the time 2008 rolled around, the Commission was receiving 1,200 grant applications a year and funding just under 10% of it. The categories in which the grants were awarded remained basically the same over those 10 years: sports, education, culture, health, and religion. It is important to note that only groups located in oil production districts were eligible to apply, with the result that the map of social and cultural funding in the Perm region quickly began to overlay the map of oil projects, of oil deposits. This map shows the spread of Lukoil Perm's social and cultural projects in the Perm region in 2004 on the right, next to, on the left here, a map of the oil deposits underneath the Perm region. So in orange are the oil deposits, and on top of those districts grow up this massive funding for social and cultural projects. I was talking with the head of a district that doesn't have any oil at one point, and I was talking about a cultural program, and I said, you should apply for, at that point they had a district level regional, Perm regional cultural capital. You should apply to be a cultural capital of the Perm region. He said, we can't apply to be a cultural capital. We can't have culture. We don't have any oil. So close geographical relationship between oil and culture sponsored by the company. So there's a lot to say about these projects, which were billed by many as the face of Lukoil in the Perm region. But for today, I want to focus on the ways in which the materiality of oil helped drive reconceptualizations of the history and culture of the Perm region through this corporate funding. The first thing to note is that the first and primary category of project awards was cultural production. Indeed, in the decade of projects between 2002 and 2012, the largest percentage of grants, this is around 40%, was awarded in the culture and spirituality category. Why culture? One former member of the Connections with Society division framed the question with which she and her colleagues wrestled in their first months as follows. How are you going to relate to the non-Lukoil employees who live in oil-producing districts? The very first answer that they arrived at was in the domain of culture, the revival of folk handicrafts. In 2002, after a judging process that included ethnographers and museum experts, the company gave grants to a number of carefully selected artisans with the goal of enabling them to begin their own small businesses producing and selling folk arts and handicrafts. I asked another former employee why Lukoil Perm's initial focus was specifically on artisanal handicrafts. That decision, she said, was linked to the high level of unemployment in those districts. In the north of the Perm region, in the Cherden, Usoli, and other districts, there was never any agriculture that could feed people. What was there to do? And so we had this idea of self-employment. Sit home, sew, make some pottery, do something else, and maybe you can get some sort of income. Miserly income, to be sure, but at least you'll have something to do. This was the company's thinking in 2001 or so. Some of the classic dilemmas of the first post-socialist decade are here. How to create employment and income in largely rural districts that were struggling to survive without socialist-era agricultural subsidies. How to manage the turn to production and petty trade across rural areas of the former Soviet world. Through its grants to folk artisans, Lukoil Perm understood itself, and certainly it advertised itself, to be working to close the gap between oil workers and nearly everyone else through the revival of folk handicrafts. Folk culture would be, in short, an entrepreneurial lifeline for the oil-producing districts of the Perm Region. Whatever its success on the score of reducing inequalities, which was modest at the very best by all accounts, Lukoil's grants for folk handicrafts production accomplished other things, not least of which was burnishing the company's image a bit. Along the way is not too much to say. These corporate grants became the primary vector for the revival of cultural production in the 2000s in the region. This is the annual folk handicrafts show and sale in Perm, which became vastly popular in around 2009 or so. Sponsored by Lukoil, you can see that all these different booths based on different regions are set up. The entire space of the craft fair is organized in the same way that that map that I showed you is, where all the central districts that are oil producers also have the central craft production sites in the show space. But Lukoil Perm's role in fostering local cultural revivals was more than one of simply providing the funds that underwrote festivals or encouraging markets and folk handicrafts. Here we return once again to the materiality of oil. As I researched these CSR projects, it became apparent that they highlighted one particular material quality of oil, its geological depth beneath the Perm region, and associated that depth with the legitimacy and authority of something else that could be considered deep and valuable, culture. Let me give you a few examples of what this increasingly dense relationship between the depths of oil and the depths of culture looked like in practice. In 2004, the head of the Ordad district in the southern Perm region spoke on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of Permian oil, for which Lukoil Perm had organized the massive folk festival. We are delighted that the oil industry organized a festival celebrating 75 years of Permian oil on our territory. It's not a coincidence that the festival was held in our district. More than 400,000 tons of oil are pumped from our territory beneath our territory every year, and our traditional folk crafts are recognized not only in Russia, but around the world as well. Here's the very similar comments from the head of the nearby Usolia district at another summer festival in 2004. I'm especially delighted that Usolia's birthday has also become a feast day for the oil industry, which is celebrating the 75th anniversary of Permian oil. In our district in 2004, we estimate that 600 million tons of oil will be extracted, more than 16% of the Perm region's production. The residents of Usolia are also preserving the historical and cultural traditions of the past and presenting them around the world. Across the Perm region, the face of oil production was increasingly the face of so-called traditional culture, as you can see from the billboard outside the main offices of Lukoil Perm, with which I began, Lukoil Perm producing tradition, with these juxtapositions of oil and tradition on either side. And there are many more examples. To move through the renovated rooms of the local history museum in Kungur, reconstructed in large part with Lukoil grants, was to move through the standard progression of Russian and Soviet history in museums, and then suddenly to come to this room, where Lukoil Perm appeared as dominating the most recent stage of history, the last in a succession from ancient artifacts to the present day. Lukoil Perm was becoming the chief regional specialist in the geological, historical, and cultural depths of the region. By 2009, it made eminent sense for the small city of Lisva, southeast of Perm, to stage a year-long celebration of local history and culture under the slogan, Lisva, a deposit of culture, Mestorождение of culture. Mestorождение, or literally birthplace, is a term used for underground oil and gas reservoirs. It sounds very odd, although intelligible, when applied to culture. In all of these examples, depth, as the material quality of oil, along with the infrastructures built to extract and transport it, features prominently in oil's reincarnation as a sponsored cultural project in an oil-producing district. Note, too, the distance from the Soviet period, when it was factories, steel, metals, and hammers that saturated cultural production. As in its geological explorations and drilling operations, Lukoil Perm was most interested in certain strata of history and culture. Their cultural programming was, for example, especially interested in the Stroganovs, and the company often cast itself as latter-day reincarnations of this most famous of the Perm Region noble families in the imperial era. The Stroganovs' many factories, residences, and headquarters, spread throughout what are now the central and northern districts of the Perm Region, overlap significantly with the territory of Lukoil Perm, and they provided ample opportunities to link the depths of oil being exploited by the company to this particular stratum of regional cultural history. As exhibits and displays of Lukoil's own materials from the depths, beakers with oil, derricks, drilling pipes, began appearing in museums, so too did exhibits and indeed entire exhibition complexes dedicated to the Stroganov era, including both items of material culture and entire buildings, churches, offices, and so on, that had been reduced to ruins in the Soviet and early post-Soviet period. The Stroganovs, boasted one Lukoil Perm executive, had a marvelous motto. The riches are for the fatherland, the name is for ourselves. And if, in recent times, he went on, Lukoil Perm is opening up more and more through the sponsorship of social and cultural projects, then I hope all of it is done for the benefit of thousands of people who live in the region. In 2006, the fifth in a series of Lukoil-sponsored historical cities that become a river region festivals was held in the old Stroganov center of Lukoil. The festival was complete with its by then common components of new museum exhibits, folks-craft show and sale, folklore ensembles, and so on. The weekend also included specialist roundtables dedicated to ongoing improvements of corporate, social, and cultural projects as a technique of regional and district development and management. The theme of the entire festival, held on the 400th anniversary of the founding of Rusolia, was "From Stroganov traditions of management, the socially responsible business of the 21st century." And if it seemed that all that was missing was in Lukoil Perm's efforts to wrap itself in the legacy of the Stroganovs, by linking the material depth of oil and the depth of culture was a real live Stroganov, this was a comparatively minor obstacle. Lukoil Perm flew in a special guest from Paris, the last known living member of the Stroganov line, the Baroness Helene de Ludinghausen, herself a major supporter of architectural restoration in Russia through the Stroganov Foundation. The origins of the Stroganov slogan, "The riches are for the fatherland, the name is for ourselves," are not especially clear. But it only began to appear on the family crest in the late 19th century, and are as remarkable as the late 1990s and early 2000s for its critiques of inequalities of the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a small elite. There were, to be sure, many differences between the imperial period and the post-Soviet period. The Stroganovs were not especially well known for their grant competitions. But Lukoil Perm's embrace of the Stroganov legacy points to at least one important similarity. Out in this province in the Urals, at any rate, the power of the Russian state has long been inextricably tied to the power of regionally influential nobles, to such an extent that it makes little sense to talk about one separately from the other. It was that legacy, as much as the legacy of philanthropy, that Lukoil Perm's revival of the Stroganov name in the Perm Region in the 2000s bespoke. It's a major part of why I think we need to attend to Russian oil on the ground every bit as much as at the commanding heights. Incidentally, I'll just note before I wrap up that Russian corporate-state relationships in the energy sector are often cast as somehow aberrant or too cozy or far outside the norm, but in comparison to what, it seems to me. Looking at Lukoil Perm corporate social responsibility and development initiatives, I see one historically inflected dimension of a global current process of corporatization, one that includes everything from Hobby Lobby and Citizens United to the CSR projects of Western oil and mining giants around the world, which in many places play similar parastatal functions to what's going on with oil in the Perm region. So given that you've read the next stage of my tale, which is the permacultural project that comes next, I'll stop at this point. But I hope to have given you at least a prehistory through which I understand the struggles of Perm as a cultural capital. The initial emphasis on culture emerging from Lukoil Perm's corporate response to critiques, the analogs to the Russian Cobra exhibition and Lukoil's folk handicraft projects that preceded them by about a decade, 8 or 9 years, and the succession of oil-based materialities through petrobarter, then Vexels, then CSR projects that brought together this deep oil and culture. And I'll leave you with one of my favorite images from the chapter you read, this drawing by Ilya Viktorov to illustrate Alexei Ivanov's spine of Russia. As I discuss in more detail in the chapter itself, it seems to be no coincidence that when casting about for a way to illustrate the shape and significance of Perm's regional identity and its difference from federal identity, they hit upon a pipeline sunk into a regional landscape controlled by a regional noble who looks ready to shut off the flow in Moscow. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Floor is open. Questions, comments?
So what I was really surprised to find in this excellent project was the need for legitimacy, the efforts of the industry that seemed already to have so much power to try to locate itself in the local, in the cities and kind of cultural landscape. And this seems somewhat different from the industries in the West. In kind of, I mean, Texas has some of these projects, but it's not to the extent that they're very self-consciously building that legitimacy. And I'm just surprised why, what forces has there been literally riots or any kind of very obvious unrests that they would be trying to kind of push, respond to, or what are these kind of bigger political landscape that we feel to need to work on?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways, I think the most, well, I guess the choices. I don't think that popular critiques were the biggest concern. If it were only some people in oil production districts being unhappy, I don't think that we would have gotten all of this. I think the biggest and most significant critiques or demands for participation in social and cultural development transmission came from various levels of state agencies, from the federal level on down. So the Perm Regional state apparatus itself was leaning fairly heavily on oil because they didn't have much money in their own budget. And so that level of critique was a pretty powerful one that I think is probably more determinative of this than ground level discontent. Although people in production districts had a lot of ability to make trouble for the oil if they wanted to. There was not a lot of it, but I think it was understood that they had that ability. It's also the case that from the very early days in these petrobarter and Bechtel circuits, the people running the companies and the people running the regional state administration were very closely tied together. Both of their accumulation and power strategies relied closely on each other. So it's not even an entirely separate question of the legitimacy of the company was so wrapped up in the legitimacy of the local state that I think it leads out in that direction as well. But it's a different configuration than certainly, if you compare this to the anthropology of the extractive industry in other parts of the world, you do get much more active protest and pushback, and certainly in Latin America, barricades or companies have their own paramilitary police forces that are major players. We don't find that here. I think the vectors are differently arranged.
You can introduce yourself also.
My name is Leonid Pisakhin. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department here. I just wanted to say that having seen this project being 5 years ago, I think that it's taken shape beautifully.
That's not the direction you expected.
No, it came together very well. Obviously I'm coming to this from a very different perspective from political science, but nevertheless it's fascinating. I have a couple of clarification questions, if I may. The first thing I wanted to sort of just note, just based on my impressions, is when you talk about the role of a neftyalik, the perception of who a neftyalik is, in the late Soviet period, I wonder if Perm Region somehow is different from others. So for example, when you think of neftyaliki in Siberia or in the Far East, they were actually deeply respected, exactly because they need hardship money. And in the bigger context of the Soviet system, these were highly respected figures in those ways. Now, I wonder whether the situation is very different in Permsky Krai, is because there is so much more going on. There are these other industries, much better established. And so, this is not a challenge in any way. I'm just saying that in the broader setting, perhaps neftyaliki has somewhat of a different interpretation. And connected with that is my question about context. What else is going on here in the 1990s and 2000s? What's happening with these other industries, the established industries that had been there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Could it be the case that they simply have more or less disappeared, or they've declined so dramatically that oil, by definition, had come to take their place and had become central to this process simply because there is nothing else. You know, oil is the only industry that sustains the region. Or, you know. Whereas during the Soviet period, things were very, very different. The structural conditions were very different. And so I think it'd be nice to introduce maybe that just for contextual reasons. And then my second question, and really it's just a clarification question. I remember early on you wanted to tell the story very much a bottom-up story. And I have this tendency as a political scientist to always think top-down. And so I wonder what happens to the story if we introduce the top-down element to it. And specifically in terms of linking the exit story of the 1990s and the social responsibility story of the 2000s, I can see how they're linked from a bottom-up perspective in the sense that Lukoil is the central player, you know, and it remains, it becomes central player in the 1990s, it remains a central player differently in the 2000s. The reason that it's a central play is very different if one considers a top-down story, right? So the reason Lukoil is a central play in the 1990s is because of economic hardship. It's an entity that's earning hard currency, and therefore it becomes, by necessity, it becomes a central player. The social responsibility story, corporate responsibility story, it's a very different kind of process. This is a Kremlin dictated thing. Putin comes in and says, you guys better start investing in these regions where you're working, or otherwise, you know, these licenses are going to go to somebody else, right? And that's why we have the corporate responsibility story. And so the two, to my mind, if one considers them from the top-down perspective, are not as clearly linked as if one thinks of these processes from the bottom-up perspective.
Thanks. Both terrific, as I expect, questions. So, on the context issue first, absolutely. I think. You know, I was often told that I should really not base this kind of study in Perm Region because it's not representative, or you know, so that was not something. But that's not something that's really bothered me. But you're entirely right about the context of what happens when there is lieutenancy in the context of a broader factory system where you don't have something like you do in Khanty-Mansiisky, you know, autonomous region where it's just oil. There, absolutely, you get much more prestigious oil workers in the Soviet period, and in the post-Soviet period, you get just like the oil company rule. It just is. You know, somebody told me once that you know, автономия округ doesn't actually stand for that. It's actionarial общество when you're talking about Khanty-Mansiisky. So the political district is just a business. So in the Perm region, it's quite different than that. And a large part of the story that I tell is, I think, depending precisely what you say. In fact, that oil was never the dominant thing going on. In the Soviet period, production was in decline enough, and the factories were enough of a big thing that oil workers could appear this way regionally, but certainly on a national level in other regions they were higher prestige. In the post-Soviet period, you get certainly the decline of this factory base, but not its complete disappearance. And there's other stuff going on. There's Oil Italia, which is a potassium mining giant in the north. Very concentrated power rather than spread throughout the region. So oil becomes sort of the leading but not the only enterprise. Say 25% of regional tax income comes from oil. So not 90. And I think that's another reason why you get the CSR programs and you get the social and cultural development stuff, is because this is a place where Lukoil has to deal with other players. Political factions, comparatively large population compared to Siberia or places like this. And there are increasingly claims on them. You can't just operate there freely in the marketplace. So I think that colors a lot of what's going on here, absolutely. And if I were to tell a story elsewhere, it would look either less oil-focused or more oil-focused. But here it's absolutely the case, as you point out, that the context of oil within a factory industrial region that has a fairly high population is significant.
But I don't think anything you have to say is irrelevant to what's happening elsewhere.
Oh, no.
But global context.
Well, no, I think that's right. But it's just, the thing would be to contextualize the story and then watch how it traces out. So these CSR projects began in Perm. This is where, you know, in Lukoil's entire global production, whatever, they began in Perm, it's a particular set, and then they spread. You watch them spread year by year through the company's other subsidiaries elsewhere. In Russia, eventually, they percolate up to the top. Lukoil, big Lukoil that runs these globally and wherever. But it began here for precisely the reason that it was here more than anywhere else that we had to deal with other groups under the regional state and the politicians. Just quickly, absolutely, I see the point from the top-down perspective. Factual and CSR are quite different. I'm wanting to say, well, from a regional perspective, they're actually nice progressions. So I think they're, I think it's worth noting their difference, but showing the regional continuity of the same players being involved in each, and the oil companies at the local level being involved in each is also an important part of that. And you know, this played out again very differently in this region than it did in other regions. So, you know, Putin saying you must invest locally or you must keep some money in Russia to help with development is a small thing to say, and then everybody did it very differently. So it's still important to think about how that happened.
Britton Allen, anthropology.
Right, thanks. This was a really rich talk and a rich paper, and I enjoyed it a lot. I 3 questions, and they're not really critiques. I don't think they're just more sort of extensions of, you know, where this might point, if we were to push it in different directions. And the first builds on what you talked about just now about depth and sort of homology between the depth of culture and the depth of the oil deposits that are under the earth. And I was reminded of another anthropologist's work on oil. You probably are aware of Mandana Limburg, who talks about it in Oman. And the interesting thing in Oman is that there's a recognition that the oil deposits are limited. And because of that, there's this anxiety on the part of people in the Omani state that we have this limited amount of period to do all these things that we want to do. And I wonder if there's any sense in terms of the limitedness of this resource, or whether people just think of it as an unending thing. Then what the implications of that would then be for, you know, this is a reservoir of authenticity. That's what's ongoing.
Oh, I see. Good. Yeah. Right.
And then the second point I had, reading the selection that we had here, was we get a lot about the organizers who are involved in the contemporary art museum, and the different ideas that they have about this art and what it's going to do. And then we have some really great selections that I liked about the different festivals that Lukoil was organizing. And the way that people interpret those, and they seem to be very popular, and people speak about them very favorably. But what I didn't see, and what I was curious about, maybe I just missed it, was the reception of the actual art museum. Because you have this contemporary art, and I was thinking back to some of your earlier work on museums, in which there's a disconnect between the ways in which most people were interpreting museums, in a sort of Soviet vein, in which they expected a regional museum to speak about all the sort of laudable attributes of the region, you know, Soviet heroes and tractors and all these things. And then you had ethnographers and sort of organizers of museums, historians who wanted to talk about a deeper, often a pre-Soviet history of the region. And so there was a difference in terms of reception. I'm wondering, have these new contemporary artists today, what do people think about that? And the last point is a small one, and as I was looking at the paper, I think it's actually maybe not even your point, it might be someone who cited. Would you say that some of these sorts of investments in contemporary art projects are connected often with neoliberal ideas about the promotion of individual freedom, something like that? And I think it was a fascinating discussions we had here, and I'm wondering if you thought at all about whether it's neoliberal exactly, or whether it could be something else. The reason I ask is because there's this book called How New York Stole Modern Art, which you may have seen, which is about a much earlier period that's not often tagged as neoliberal, in which abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock's work was promoted by the U.S. government in various ways against sort of the Soviet Union and socialist realism, and sort of as an index of the freedom that exists But, that's sort of a tangent perhaps, but it's maybe a longer history to some of the things we're talking about.
Absolutely. 3 good questions.
You don't have to answer all of them, but some of them are just rhetorical.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm going to answer them at various lengths. Certainly, people were conscious of in Mandy's book, it's 15 years, right? We have 15 years after oil in Iran, and then we're screwed. So we have to do everything now, and the 15 years keeps moving. In the Perm region, people generally told me that there were 50 years of oil left. They'd be fine for 50 years. But certainly, the idea that oil couldn't be the only thing, or that oil might run out, was part of what's animating this cultural project. At least part of the rhetoric of this cultural project is that we're going to find something to thrive on that is unlimited, human culture. There's no scarcity. You can just shift away from the oil. There's always going to be human culture and creativity. So I did not find the link to the authenticity might run out either. I didn't find that. Yeah, this is not a project that does well with reception. It was not designed that way. I did do a lot of field work that was designed to say, what did people think of CSR projects or the museum or whatever. I think people reacted. It's a little bit harder to do that in a region when you're thinking about too many people in a region. To the CSR projects, to the museum, people reacted quite variously. Some people loved it. Many people were horrified by it. The real battle was at the level of the organizers versus the local intelligentsia. Many people didn't like the museum, nonetheless went to the festivals and had fun, so shifting there. I like very much your suggestion about thinking about the art project and this idea of creativity. It was more easily expressed in creativity than freedom, but there's probably some freedom in there. I have to go through my notes, but I think there's probably some of that in there. I'm generally, through 7 chapters of the book, I managed not to go through it, but I fail in the 8th chapter, and come on with it, with something about this. So I'm very open to thinking about that as part of the reason I'm using it there is that it's the language of a lot of the anthropology of creative cities and cultural capitals and stuff like that. And I'm sort of wanting to place this little bit of dialogue there. But I'm absolutely going to go look at the Colloquium Series and try to draw the analogy there. That's great.
If I could briefly piggyback on that, I also, when I saw New Liberal, simply because I've read it so much and I'm not entirely sure what it means always, you had a little passage where you described it a little better. And I think I think what you mean here is that if it survives the test of profit and market, then it's worth existing, and if it doesn't, then I think that's what you were saying. But on the other hand, maybe there's a place where you could say that. If you think we should use this art. Troy,
Great days. So I have 2 quick questions. First has to do with comparing what you just talked about with other works on oil that I've read recently. And I'm thinking about Andrew Apter's work in Nigeria.
Great.
And there's also this name, the author who wrote The Magical State of Venezuela.
Colonial.
Exactly. And this idea of oil being associated with spectacle, but also this idea of this kind of traditional culture as well. So is there some kind of reason why these oil regimes are drawn to this? And it happens in other places and other times. So I wonder if you can comment on that. The second thing I would say is, of course, I think everyone's read in Mitchell's book on counter democracy. And what's really interesting about counter democracy is that he stresses the materiality of oil. And it's very hard to be in energy history where oil's liquid nature versus gold's fuel density, whatever it is, actually has an effect. And I can't really think of many other people that really stress that. I'm just wondering, does oil's physical nature actually matter in this case, or doesn't?
Right. So why is it that oil states end up producing these giant festivals and stuff like this? I mean, there's various ways to get at this, some more and less sophisticated, I suppose. But combination of massive revenues flowing into states that are undergoing some degree of one or another form of independence. So post-colonial oil states, the after and Puerto Rico coast are very much those national independence stories. And So the moment when the oil revenues are flowing in is also the moment where the states become very interested in their own history and claiming the past and asserting their identity for themselves. And the oil allows them to do this in a particularly spectacular way. The oil revenues allow them to do this in a particularly spectacular way. So you can see something like that going on here. I would want to, what I try to do in the book, when I make my comparison with that, I really say that this is actually quite different, although there may be some surface similarities. It's different along a number of actions. It's post-socialist rather than post-colonial. This makes a big difference in the kinds of structures of industry relationships and expectations. It doesn't come through, at least initially, through this tight connection between oil and money, that oil money being the generator of magic of the state in both cases of Nigeria and Venezuela. It is the magic of extracting oil money that makes the state in both of these scholars. And what makes the Perm Region is actually the unimagining of oil money. It's the concreteness of it, it's the abstractness. It's not the abstractness that always part of the actual surface. So I think that axis is different. And then, particularly in Venezuela, you have massive investments in soil stuff, not just in culture, but in industry. You certainly don't have that in the Perm Region. This is for a new age of creative cities. It's investment in culture, modernized through cultural development rather than industrial development. So I think there's a family of things going on here, but I also am wanting to insist on the difference in particularities of the socialist case as against those.
What about the idea of oil? I mean, going back to Upton Sinclair, has this crossed your mind at all? The analogy, which is, oil is this huge weapon, this huge tool, which is hugely destructive and hugely productive at the same time, as a way of reformatting everything, including human relations, transition from one era to another, and that kind of thing. Now, of course, he means something different. We never thought we would transition from socialism. So there we have it. And there was some of what you're describing, it seems to me, is really this really penetrating, comprehensive, deep rethinking of who we are and how our relations are at every level, including, in this case, art. Does this make sense? I'm sure you've thought of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the way people are experiencing this. This is the, if there is a standard story about oil that makes it, it's completely transformative. Its potential for complete transformations of social identities is certainly there. It's there in the first contact oil stories about Saudi Arabia, the discovery of oil there that completely transforms all kinds of social relations. So I think this is another story like that.
So as I was reading the chapter, it seems to be you're speaking about cultural models on three different levels, particularly when you're talking about art and exhibits and museums. It seems to take place on three levels in particular. I don't know if you had this in mind, but this is what came across to me as a reader. I'm probably interested to know what a reader, how
absolutely.
It goes with that.
Yeah.
And if you didn't need to say certain things, it still allows me to say them. Pick them as you wrote, right?
Absolutely.
So the effect it had on me is to look at you seem to be dancing between, or moving freely between three models. The idea of mapping, or putting Perm on the map, I thought was evocative and was useful, but there are different maps in play. There's not just one map. And I was wondering, as we went along, maybe you talk about more explicitly what those maps are. But very briefly, very just to alert the reader. And one of them is, I think the most obvious one for post-Soviet Russia, or for that matter if you live in New York, which is an art which is really escapes from social realities, and so it's meant not to be connected to social realities. Which is to say that it's acceptable to those who are going to pay for the art also. There is that reality. Here we call it hitting and philanthropy. Our universities also depend on these things. And so there's certain areas which are safer to explore and certain areas to go into. And speaking with Russian giving people recently, who don't give very much, but nevertheless give, they're pretty explicit about it. There's certain things that we will not pay for. Why would I pay for that? And it's a fair question. You hold all the power. Why would you want to pay for something subversive? For something that ridicules me. And those who understood that they were being ridiculed who say, well, I won't pay for it. I won't allow it. Right? So it produces a different kind of art. So it's not only the culture of art, it's also the substance of the art. What can and cannot be said. And so it's virtual, in a sense it's very deliberately not to be grounded in a social reality. And in fact, I don't see much of a sociality here, and that's suggestive to me. Not in these chapters at least. And the idea of, I read this bubble, I think Kant captured that very well. It seems to me that's what he was heading for. That's one art, and that's one very familiar to us in New York City, for example. Safe, it's safe. Where it's politically safe, it's socially safe. But there's another one which is, you also touched on, which is the idea of transient culture, a place which exists only because, it's a different sense of a bubble. It's the bubble in the sense of Abu Dhabi, Oman, the Gulf states and whatnot. That's a different kind of bubble. It's meaning there's some doubt about whether this place will still exist in 20 years. Now, NYU is heavily invested in one of these places, but it's just always on our minds. So we build these things, they're literally built on a desert. And will they still be here in 20 years? If you pull the plug on something, the whole thing just go into the ocean, right? But there's a similar feeling that I have here, which is that you can pour this petro money into creating a kind of art, but is it a lasting art of any sort? And I had explained the trends, and it's a different notion of bubble and a different cultural model also. It's, Abu Dhabi thing for the Guggenheim, for NYU, and Yale, and so on and so forth. Right? The third one is a more specifically Russian model, and you touched on Boris Groys, and also in those latter parts of the chapter is very interesting, I thought, where you kept returning to the centrality of the state and the scalability of the state. And it happens in two ways. The less permanent way is what you're speaking about, which is the government simply comes in and gives instructions. What's happening here is different because the local actors, the local in the sense that they're there and they own things, those actors are actually appealing to the state as the final arbiter at every step of the way. And in the process, they potentially create the seeds of their own destruction, because they themselves are admitting, passively or explicitly, that they don't have control over these things, and they're inviting state power into arbitrary. If you look at it that way, then that's Boris Groys and the avant-garde. No matter what they said, like this, I think they're saying this is possibly menacing in the sense that it's cutting off the supply. No matter what they say, they themselves have accepted that they don't have control over their own futures because they're asking someone else to decide it them. And that's a more Russian story to me. That's what I thought about culture. One quick note, which is in your talk, but I didn't notice in the paper, but the idea of oil and emergence, right, which is another notion, it sounds very much like the gold standard. Did you make that analogy possibly?
Not precisely, but yes, right.
Yeah.
That is partially the idea.
Mm-hmm. Which is it's a psychological trick because it's you probably can't actually get a barrel of oil by turning the excess. You could theoretically, but you probably can't.
No, you could. I mean, that is actually they did, but that was not the primary purpose.
No, but I mean, so
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I could get a big tip, or I could buy it. Right? And I would walk up to someone and say, "Could you please give me a barrel of oil?" So theoretically, I could do that, but it's more the psychological comfort, right? And with the gold standard, even in recent decades, if you had, even in the 70s, you had a Canadian dollar, you'd walk into a Canadian bank, and theoretically, the bankers are supposed to give you that much in gold, like whatever goes with that. Now, nobody actually goes and requests it.
Well, yeah, I mean, on that point, I think oil is...
In Weimar, Germany, theoretically, in 1925, you're supposed to be able to hand in a new mark and receive a piece of German real estate, theoretically. But anyway.
Well, this is all terrific. I will certainly think more about all three of those. And what's interesting is the way that, I think in the way I've set up the chapter, what's interesting is the way that those arguments are deployed by variously situated people themselves, right? It's not necessarily going to be my analytical.
That was so beautiful about the chapter.
Take on it is that you get this idea of transience, and somehow, Guggenheim is transient. We're building something different. Our museum is going to be different because it's not just this sort of popular Guggenheim thing. And then, of course, the critique that this is precisely the cultural bubble. But that's very helpful to think about, and also the ways that the state appears there as final arbiter. I have to think more about how that works out, because of course what these, everybody's appealing, the number of letters of complaint that were sent to Moscow to like come and sort this out, right?
Yeah.
Like we have, could you please like come and do an investigation of regional Ministry of Culture and like get rid of these guys. But that is itself a need that needs to create kind of statements.
And so you shift the conversation out, because most people have read about these things. And the way that a lot of business people in Russia will speak about state power is, we are free to the extent we're outside of state power and free of state compulsion. Right? And then so then recently when they took over one of the other oil operations,
Right, just done in both.
which was more a revenue issue than a political one. And everyone says, you see what's happening with regard to our freedoms and whatnot. And so we say, so Putin came into this period of this stage also. It's a matter of to what extent has state power repressed, absorbed and so on, local society, something in the economy which is supposed to be separate from the state. But your actors, and this is what you're so keenly aware of in this chapter, your actors themselves recognize that the state has a role to play in their own things, even if they say it doesn't. And there's a certain tension there, which to me is a specifically Russian tension.
That's interesting.
Betty Banks?
I have kind of a silly question possibly.
No such thing.
So, I was just talking about sort of how some kind of after Troy's point about like the sort of the spectacle of oil states, and then you saying it's post-socialist expression rather than post-colonial expression, and then sort of thinking about like creative cities and art and this like big investment. And then I suddenly thought of how all the new art galleries in Moscow and London are owned by oligarchs' daughters, and I was thinking, so like to what extent is this about oil, or is it to do with like new money out of these big industries? And I'm just, and that's kind of where my question is going as far as it's got, but just sort of, like, is it actually something just sort of like a sort of 20 years after post-socialism, or is it specifically about what, like the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would not try to extract those from each other, those questions. I think it's both. Of course, the other way that modern contemporary Africa really serves is as a sort of distinction, right, of being plugged into these very rarefied, very expensive worlds of taste and appreciation of arts and things like that. And that has something to do with why it's oligarchs and oligarchs' daughters involved in this scene, and that's not either. Rockefeller way that then is a similar kind of story about where the oil wealth goes and how these accumulate in dynasties that reincarnate their wealth in the cultural sector of companies. That's a very old story as well. So not particularly Brazilian in that case, but as I'm trying to show here, at least at this level, when we're talking about the little art galleries in Perm and the museum, there's a quite regional story that emerges out of these earlier moments and relationships with the company as well.
Sarah, back?
So I've just got a very brief comment really, which is just kind of building on what Yanni was talking about. I'm quite interested in the ways in which they construct history, the way in which they find a safe past, and I like this idea that Yanni had about the safety of the cultural sphere as not connected to social realities. So I couldn't help seeing, the use of the Stroganoff family and folk art as kind of safe, neutral, non-Soviet, kind of an imagined Russian past, rather than any kind of gritty, real Russian history, which they're actually very comfortable with. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the. I mean, it's cast very much as a, you're going to make an income doing this sort of thing. So this is how you're going to make your own business, and you can be an entrepreneur, and you can make money because there's going to be tourist industry and these other things. But I think that part of what it does is to transport people to another time or place. Precisely, I mean, that is the grammar of it is that another time or
an imagined peasant Russia.
An imagined, yeah, sure, it's an imagined peasant Russia, or it's a magical world of magical sort of landscapes. Although it's, but it's very much cast in language of, we're doing this as a development initiative. We realize there are problems, and we are here to solve those problems. And economic development in the rural districts, the Perm Region is difficult, and agriculture is difficult, and there's no jobs. We, the company, are fixing that by providing jobs, by providing a tourist industry, by training people to be entrepreneurs in this new way. So I see both things going on. It certainly is not ignorant of, because it starts in discontent with social reality. It is an attempted transformation of critique.
So just yesterday we were talking about this, that we had another session with, Dara Goldsman?
I know the name.
She's a food editor. She's actually Slavist, but she's a food editor. Someone just saw it yesterday. There's this magazine called Gastronomica, sort of popularizes academic food studies. Anyway, so she was talking about the high tables of, what was the woman's name? Oh, I know, it was Lotman who studies the menus from the high table, or the private parties of Bruno Wolf, that family?
Yeah.
And so the question came up about the Lotman is, why does someone with such a great brain simply repeat to us what was on the menus in 1857? And you look at tongue of bison and all these things on the menu, and it's sort of like it's pornographic on the one hand, and on the other hand it's sort of like, what's the meaning of it? Lotman of all people, why did you waste the last years of your life doing this, right? Which is some of, I think, one of the subtexts of what we're talking about. And so one of the answers that seemed to satisfy everybody was, well, it's escapism. Lotman was alive just after the collapse. He was in poor health. So it's not only his decadence instead of union, but his personal decadence. Right. Escapism. Does that satisfy you?
Does escapism satisfy me for what's going on with
material?
With stuff? I mean,
well, frolicking peasants and things like that.
Yeah, frolicking peasants, or historical reenactments, or things like
Stroganoffs.
that. Stroganoffs.
Or is it so far removed from your work we need not talk about?
Well, no. Clearly it's a major issue, but I'm back into this was not a project where I was into the reception question, and it seems to me that's how do people receive and respond to this as an escapist for people. I think it's clearly Lukoil is happy if people are flipping something rather than earning the pipeline. But for people, is it a kind of escapism? And I think to some extent it is, but people that I knew, including many people who worked for Lukoil and for these cultures, are deeply cynical about this stuff. They were escaping nowhere. They saw this as PR. They saw this as modes of engagement that they had to work with and transform in order to make it the things that they considered to be valuable. So I'm not entirely comfortable with this being a simple kind of escapism. It was something that was present. It was an indicator of who was powerful and where the money was coming from and what we needed to do to make things valuable in their own way. But I don't think it was just escapism. People frequently took these resources for these projects and transformed them into other projects, which I would not say were escapism. So that clearly, the Big Summer Festival in the was precisely why people were there, precisely celebrating the but I think I would want more to that story.
We should bring up food studies because of beef stroganoff. Or flat trade. Anyways.
Or you throw that in too, right?
But my other point was, it's more of a comment. You're talking about creative cities and neoliberalism and all that. And I read an interview with Mr. Florida recently, and he's very sad. He called it a neoliberal, and he was just quoting Marx and Kautsky the whole time, because he was lefty credentials. I'm not sure how convincing it was.
Actually, on Richard Florida, I kept thinking about that whole early 2000s and how important it was for thinking of branding the cities in terms of, say, high tech will only come if there is a vibrant intellectual culture and arts, that's what replaces creativity. So to what extent what is happening in Perm is also probably this global attention to these diverse urban.
That was the governor's dream, right? I mean, the governor spent a lot of time in these cities around the world, in Brazil, and reported on what's going on. High-tech industry, the film industry here, or so, I've just been to Glasgow and I come back, and Glasgow is doing this, and we could do this, and there was a lot of huge conferences and huge efforts to like say, what is our particular cultural niche that we can get that is like all these other places? And this whole cultural capital campaign was designed to be that project that moved the whole city through that in the way that other European cities line up for.
I mean, Chicago had its own research team trying to figure out what is culture to exactly in a very similar way.
Yeah, this was exactly the project of this one.
And so, but on the other hand, there seems that genealogy of the socialist kulturnost, right? That kind of historical importance of culture and socialism. You were tracing the first part of the talk, we traced the history of oil. Is there space for talking this kind of history of kulturnost as an important feature of the Soviet working class?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the whole cultural project people did not speak a language of kulturnost. That sounded very Soviet to them. They had whole creative cities around talking that. Many of their critics were into that, saying like, we're not educating people in culture. We don't have music. We're not funding music school and drama school, and it's all these spectacles and culture. It's not in culture. I recognize we should be making people more cultural, right? So it should be more English. You can't go to the Modern Art Museum. You don't learn about art. You're just like assaulted by all this stuff. Is the way they would phrase it. There's nothing important about that. So it was an element of the critical discourse, but the folks in charge saw. The cultural project saw kulturnost as a technique of Soviet state indoctrination and legitimation of power, and they wanted nothing to do with it.
And I'm interested in how you are thinking about how this project relates to your book, your previous book, project, because it seems to me that in both cases you have interesting sort of situations for thinking about how people think of themselves nationally. The first project, and maybe butcher it a little bit, is sort of, in a very abstract way, it's the kind of, the innovative ways in which people deal with outside influence and sort of imperatives for how to live that come from outside, and while hanging on to a sense of themselves and what they're about. And there it's kind of, all right, we're in a town that's nearby, near Perm, and there's nothing particularly special about the ground itself. It's more about the people and their history. That's, again, whereas here we're dealing with natural resources, and this is a different framing. So it seems that the idea of outside influence or outside connections is far less sort of threatening. It makes much more sense here in a sort of comfortable way. And so, again, if that's fair to say, or that's something I assume, but so when we're thinking about things like international relations today, Ukraine on one side, relation to China on another, both really involved in oil and how that's used as a currency in Russia, and involved in Russia's position in the world, position in the former Soviet Union, or East Asia. And so I was just wondering whether that's a sort of, that this is a much more kind of comfortable, sort of potent way of thinking about those connections to national connections to those outside sort of imperatives.
Sort of like the next scale up.
Perhaps. I'm just wondering how you're, because I think I see a lot of similarity there, potentially, depending on who you're talking to and etc. I just
You
wondering.
mean at the larger level?
Yeah. And I'm just wondering how you're with this last month or already in the manuscript, how you're expressing perhaps the connections between the two projects, so if at all.
Right. Seems like a pretty good summary of my book. I don't seem to remember much of what was in there. But yeah, I mean, the difference, I've been in some where I experienced the difference very much between the two projects as one being based on a fairly traditional kind of framework where it's very much about how people make sense of and interpret the stuff that's coming at them and efforts to change the world, essentially. But here, I was not actually interested, for the most part, in the ways people responded or to or diverted or whatever. It was not a reception-based study of any particular place. It was in large part about the people generating those things. It was about the conditions under which all kinds of people had to deal with remaking themselves, right? It was whatever you did in the Perm Region, you had to deal with this intersection of oil and culture and state. And I'm not so much interested in what people did, but in that intersection of oil and culture and state. So that's sort of the way I've experienced the differences between the two projects. It's very kinds of field work. I felt uncomfortable many times thinking about a large region and basically lead projects and leaving that space of how people respond out. You know, but certainly I mean, I actually would say that the insider-outsider thing is is replicated in that, you know, what we have here is a series of projects hatched in Moscow that come to the Perm Region and how does the Perm Region deal with this. So that's a way in which I see some continuity. I'm not sure how I would frame either of these within a sort of IR context, Ukraine, things like that. I haven't thought that through. Although my instinct is to think in terms of similar kinds of questions about how and where oil is flowing, what it means in context, and how those kind of things influence larger political quarters in ways that we don't appreciate if we just look at treaties or like pipeline routes or whatever. That would be my instinct, but I don't necessarily think this is somehow scalable to that.
Is it the Muslim populations coming to this at all?
Absolutely, southern part of the Perm Region. So I gave you the part about the Stroganovs, which is the northern part of the Perm Region. But southern part of the Perm Region is largely, well, not largely, but significantly Muslim Tatar Bashkir populations. And there you hear nothing from Stroganovs. But there's a great deal about sort of the royal family of nations that's from a very different era of history. It's very Soviet. Yeah, absolutely. So in that chapter I was Stroganov thing, and I said that, you know, they're interested in this other stratum of history down in the south, and there's a lot about, you know, national distinctiveness and national contributions and tolerance, and how the oil company is facilitating this.
And distinctive national dress.
Distinctive national dress, absolutely, right. So all of these things, and you know, to the extent that the Perm Region has been fairly low on the scale of sort of interethnic tension among Russian regions, you know, Lukoil has something to do with that in providing these kinds of festivals, these places, where everybody, all the ethnographers, all the specialists, all the state people are constantly engaged in these intercultural festival dialogues that bring in all the local politicians and all the local leaders and have them working on Lukoil-focused projects in one sort or another. So the company's really provided that language in the south, whereas it's the Stroganov language that prevails in the north. And for a while, this mapped on actually, sort of simplified the story here, this actually mapped onto two different Lukoil subsidiaries. It gets complicated, but there was actually a separate, for 10 years, between 1995 and 2004, there were two separate Lukoil subsidiaries in the region. One in the north that was a split subsidiary between sort of local elites, the Petrostate crowd, alumni, and big Lukoil, and in the south, which was a wholly owned Lukoil subsidiary. That was the largely Muslim Tatar Bashkir. That was the old Soviet identity. The north was the, you know, the financisti, the people who were doing deals and all kinds of circulation and currency. Those were eventually put together, but the CSR stuff started in the north and spread to the south of the region before it spread out of the region. So these kinds of different cultural things actually matched up on and were implicated in quite different corporate structures for about 10 years. But you have to read the book for that one.
Which we all will, It's a very useful model, I think, for all of us, which is, a small place relatively speaking, but big ideas and vice versa. The place becomes much bigger in the process. We wish you every success with your project.
Thank you for excellent questions and for listening and for reading.
I hope that
We
we
appreciate it. It's wonderful. Many terrific leads to follow up on here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.